no American president had been killed in office.
As Lincoln's body lay in state, all through the city, you could hear just silence that pervaded the city.
35 years after Abraham Lincoln's assassination, his coffin was unexpectedly opened on September 26, 1901. What the 23 witnesses saw stunned them. Lincoln's face was still recognizable, his features eerily peaceful, despite the passage of time and signs of decay. Among those present was 13-year-old Fleetwood Lindley, whose haunting memory of that day stayed with him until his death in 1963.
He said that the president's features were covered in a thin, chalky white mold that looked like a layer of frost.
And now, we're about to unveil one of America's most unsettling and mysterious presidential moments. The silent casket. When the lid of Abraham Lincoln's coffin was finally lifted, it wasn't historians or government officials standing there. It was two local plumbers, Leon Hopkins and Charles Willey. They had been chosen by Robert Todd Lincoln, the president's only surviving son, who wanted absolute proof that his father's body was still inside after years of rumors claiming it had been stolen or replaced. It had been 35 years since Lincoln's death. And inside that small tomb in Springfield, Illinois, a group of 23 witnesses gathered. Some were close to the Lincoln family. Others were local craftsmen called in to help seal the coffin for good. No cameras, no reporters, just a few men and the weight of history staring back at them. Hopkins and Willey carefully removed the lid. The smell of time filled the room, thick and musty. For a long moment, no one spoke. The faint beam of light revealed a face still recognizable after decades in the ground. The tall forehead, the familiar beard, and even the mole on his right cheek. It was Abraham Lincoln. Some witnesses stepped closer, their curiosity fighting their fear. Others turned away, unable to look. One man fainted. What they saw wasn't a skeleton or a ghost from the past. It was a face preserved by the dryness of the tomb, eerily lifelike, as if the president had simply fallen asleep and never woken up. That moment finally proved what people had wondered for years. Abraham Lincoln's body was never moved or stolen, but it also left a strange feeling behind.
He was limited and constrained by his times in ways that are disappointing. And then I can also say, yeah, but look at what he did.
The rumor began. After Abraham Lincoln was laid to rest, most people thought that chapter of history was finally closed. But in the years that followed, peace was the last thing his grave would know. In 1876, something almost unbelievable happened. A group of counterfeiters from Chicago decided to steal Lincoln's body. Their plan wasn't political or personal. It was pure desperation. Their top engraver, Benjamin Boyd, had been arrested by the Secret Service. And without him, their fake money operation was falling apart. So they came up with a plan so bold it sounded like fiction. Steal the president's body, demand $200,000 in ransom, and use his remains to bargain for Boyd's release. The men behind the plot were Jack Hughes and Terrence Mullen. They waited for the perfect distraction. Election night, November 7, 1876, when the country would be too busy celebrating or worrying about the results to notice anything strange happening in Springfield, Illinois. That night, the thieves quietly broke into Lincoln's tomb. The air was cold, the cemetery dark. They worked fast, using metal saws and pry bars to break open the marble and lift the heavy coffin. They had already dragged it partway out when everything fell apart. What they didn't know was that Secret Service agent Patrick D. Tyrrell had been following them for weeks. He and his team were hiding nearby, waiting for the right moment. Just as the thieves began to move the coffin, the agents moved in. Shots were fired, the men ran, and chaos erupted in the cemetery. The news spread across the country within days. Americans were horrified. The idea that someone had almost stolen the body of Abraham Lincoln, the man who saved the nation, felt unthinkable. The failed theft set off a wave of fear and suspicion. If grave robbers could get that close once, what if they had succeeded another time? To keep Lincoln safe, officials secretly buried his coffin deeper, even hiding it in different locations inside the tomb to confuse anyone who tried again. Only a few trusted workers knew where the real coffin rested. Still, the whispers didn't stop. Some people claimed the government was lying, that the body had already been replaced with sandbags or stones. Rumors like that only grew with time. Visitors said they'd heard strange stories, that the real Lincoln wasn't even there anymore. By the turn of the century, the curiosity became too much to ignore. The only way to end the speculation once and for all was to do the unthinkable. Open the coffin and see what was really inside.
But he shall not have them. No. Gold cannot buy.
The flashback. The night of April 15th, 1865, was a night that changed America forever. Inside Ford's Theater in Washington, laughter filled the room as the audience enjoyed the play. Then came a single gunshot that shattered the air. Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States, was struck by John Wilkes Booth. Within seconds, the cheerful crowd turned into chaos. People screamed, soldiers rushed to the stage, and word of the tragedy spread through the streets like wildfire. By morning, the entire nation was grieving. Church bells rang, flags were lowered, and thousands gathered in tears. The man who had led the country through its darkest war was gone. His body was carefully prepared and placed in a coffin, then carried through the Capitol under heavy guard. But you might think that's the end of Lincoln's journey. No, it was the beginning of a strange and uneasy story that would follow his body for many years. Over time, his coffin was moved several times. Officials feared grave robbers might try to steal the president's body and demand a ransom. Each move was done quietly, with only a handful of trusted people present, and each time they buried him deeper, hoping to end the rumors. The funeral train that carried him across the country was slow and solemn. Millions gathered along the tracks to say goodbye as it passed by. Wrapped in black drapes and flickering lanterns, old photographs show candle-lit vigils and silent crowds standing shoulder to shoulder in mourning. Lincoln's final resting place was meant to bring peace, but people began to question whether his body truly rested where it should. Those doubts would eventually lead to a decision that would make our jaws drop. Someone would open the coffin to find out the truth. The rising suspicion. After the failed theft in 1876, you'd think Lincoln's tomb would finally be safe. But it wasn't that simple. The attempted robbery had shaken everyone's trust. People began to whisper again. Was the real Abraham Lincoln even inside that coffin anymore? Or had something happened that the government wasn't telling them? Over time, those whispers turned into real concern. The tomb had been repaired and reinforced, but grave robbers were still a threat. Even worse, most of the men who knew the truth about where Lincoln's body was buried were getting older. If something happened to them, no one would know where the president actually rested. That fear led to the creation of a secret group known as the Lincoln Guard of Honor. Formed in Springfield, this small circle of trusted men took on one job: to protect Lincoln's remains at all costs. They weren't government officials or soldiers. They were ordinary citizens chosen for their loyalty and discretion. Once they accepted the task, they swore to keep every detail hidden, even from their families. Working under the cover of darkness, the guard quietly moved Lincoln's coffin several times inside the tomb. Sometimes they disguised it under tools and debris. At other times, they buried it beneath bricks and wood so that no thief could ever find it. Each move was done in silence, with no record left behind. The fewer people who knew, the safer Lincoln's body would be. Or so they hoped. But this secrecy came with a price. As the years passed, even members of the Guard began to lose track of where the coffin actually was. The men who did know started dying off one by one, taking their knowledge with them. By the time the new century arrived, only a handful of people could say for sure whether the president's remains were still in the tomb at all. Public curiosity only grew. Visitors came from all over the country to see the site, but many left wondering if they were paying respects to an empty grave. The tension reached a breaking point in 1901. The Guard of Honor, along with Robert Todd Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln's only surviving son, realized that the only way to end the rumors for good was to open the casket. After 25 years of secrecy and suspicion, the moment of truth had finally arrived. The decision to open the casket. By the fall of 1901, 35 years after Abraham Lincoln's assassination, his tomb in Springfield had begun to crumble. The stonework was weakening, and major repairs were needed to keep it from collapsing. But for the men of the Lincoln Guard of Honor, this was a chance to finally uncover the truth behind decades of rumors. For years, these rumors had spread that Lincoln's body might not actually be in the coffin. Some said grave robbers had taken it long ago, while others believed the government had quietly moved it and replaced it with something else. After countless secret reburials and moves within the tomb, even the Guard themselves couldn't be completely sure anymore. So, on September 26, 1901, after long discussions, and with the permission of Robert Todd Lincoln, the president's only surviving son, a decision was made. The coffin would be opened. The goal was simple: end the doubt once and for all. A total of 23 witnesses were chosen to be there. They were a mix of workers, members of the Guard, and local citizens trusted to tell the truth about what they saw. Among them stood a 13-year-old boy named Fleetwood Lindley, whose father was part of the Guard. None of them would ever forget what they were about to witness. When the day arrived, the group gathered quietly inside the tomb. The air was still, thick with anticipation. Tools clinked, chains shifted, and every movement echoed off the stone walls. Slowly, the workers began to open the coffin, layer by layer. No one spoke. All eyes were locked on that single heavy lid that had been untouched for decades. Then, at last, the lid was lifted. What they saw inside would silence some of the wildest rumors in American history, while leaving others more unsettled than ever. The big truth. The moment finally came. The men inside the tomb stood still as the heavy lid began to shift. The scraping of metal and the faint groan of wood echoed off the stone walls. Then, as the coffin opened, a sharp, powerful smell hit the room. It was so strong that several men instinctively stepped back. The scent of age, decay, and history all mixed into one unforgettable wave. For a moment, no one moved. The air felt dense, as though the past itself had just exhaled. Then, one of the lanterns tilted slightly, and its light fell across the open coffin. What they saw next left every man speechless. There he was, Abraham Lincoln. His face was still clearly recognizable, even after all those years. The skin had darkened, but his features were unmistakable. The familiar beard, the shape of his nose, and even the lines of his face were still there. Bits of red fabric, remnants of the American flag that had once draped his body, rested gently on his chest. It looked as though time had tried to fade him, but couldn't. His body had been so well preserved that it stunned everyone in the room. Some men whispered quietly, others just stared. They had opened the coffin expecting mystery or emptiness, maybe even confirmation of an old rumor. But instead, they found the truth. Abraham Lincoln still lay right where he was meant to be. The viewing was brief. Each man present took a moment to see for himself before the coffin was sealed again. To make it official, they signed sworn statements confirming that the body was indeed Abraham Lincoln's. After that, the lid was closed for the last time, and heavy boards and cement were placed over the coffin to make sure it could never be disturbed again. That quiet moment inside the tomb ended one of the most persistent mysteries in American history. But for the men who witnessed it, the image of Lincoln resting peacefully in his coffin stayed with them for the rest of their lives, a memory both haunting and deeply humbling. The reburial. After the truth was revealed, the men inside the tomb knew exactly what had to happen next. They had seen enough to silence every rumor, and their final duty was clear: to make sure Abraham Lincoln would never be disturbed again. The decision was made to give the president a resting place so secure that no one could ever reach him. The coffin was carefully sealed and placed inside a solid steel cage, built strong enough to withstand any attempt to break through. But even that wasn't enough. The men wanted absolute certainty. So workers began pouring concrete. Not just a thin layer, but 10 full feet of it. They poured it slowly, filling every space around the steel cage until the coffin was buried deep beneath an immovable slab of stone and cement. Once it hardened, there would be no way in. Not for thieves, not for curiosity, not even for time itself. When the last of the concrete settled, the tomb fell silent. Those who stood there knew they had just witnessed the end of something extraordinary. For decades, Lincoln's peace had been interrupted by rumors, by fear, and by secrecy. But now, at last, he was beyond all of it. 10 feet under, encased in steel and stone, Abraham Lincoln was finally untouchable. The man who had once held a divided nation together could finally rest in the same unbreakable peace he had spent his life fighting to create. Outside, the world moved on, unaware that beneath the quiet ground of Springfield, a chapter of American history had just been sealed forever. Theories and aftermath. Even after Abraham Lincoln was sealed beneath 10 feet of concrete, the story refused to fade away. Some people still whispered doubts, unwilling to believe that such a legend could truly rest in silence. But 23 witnesses, men from different walks of life, had all seen the same thing and signed their names to it. They swore under oath that it was Abraham Lincoln lying in that coffin. The familiar features were still there: the beard, the profile, even the small mole on his cheek. There was no mistaking who they had seen. And with that, the rumors that had haunted his legacy for decades were finally laid to rest. Yet, standing there in that quiet tomb, surrounded by stone and history, it was impossible not to feel something deeper. These men hadn't just looked upon a president. They had looked upon time itself. For a brief moment, the past had opened its eyes, reminding everyone that even legends can linger longer than anyone expects. More than a century later, people still visit his resting place in Springfield. They come not just to see a tomb, but to feel that strange connection to the man who once carried an entire nation through its darkest hour. And maybe that's the real reason the story of that day still echoes. Because when they opened Lincoln's casket, they didn't just find a body. They found proof that history, when it matters most, refuses to die. Legacy and reflection. Even after Abraham Lincoln's death, his story refused to rest. Decades passed, yet the world couldn't stop talking about him. Then came that day in 1901, when his coffin was opened one last time, and 23 witnesses looked inside. What they saw wasn't a symbol or a story. It was him, the man himself. Among those witnesses was a 13-year-old boy named Fleetwood Lindley. He would grow up to be the last living person to ever look upon Lincoln's face. Years later, when asked if he truly remembered what he saw, he simply said, "Yes, I still remember." That quiet answer carried the weight of an entire century. That moment proved something deeper than anyone expected. That Lincoln wasn't just a legend told through history books or speeches. He was real. The man who guided a nation through its darkest hour had lived, struggled, and sacrificed in ways that still echo through time. The 1901 opening didn't just close a chapter. It cemented his place as a living truth carved into the foundation of the country he fought to save. Today, when people walk the shaded path to his tomb in Springfield, they're not just paying respect to a president. They're standing above the final proof of his existence, a man encased in steel and concrete so that time could never erase him again. Inside that tomb lies more than a body. It's the story of endurance, of faith, and of a leader whose words outlived him. And that's the real legacy of Abraham Lincoln. He wasn't remembered because of monuments or quotes. He endures because, even after all the years, all the myths, and all the doubts. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.